The books of Judith and Esther. These two books in the Bible highlight the power of God over enemies of the Jewish people, and which is on display through the faithfulness and courage of two Jewish women, Judith and Esther. Like was the case with the book of Tobit, here we are dealing with a kind of Old Testament parables and not with historical writings. These books should be seen as a kind of a historical novel designed to remind the Jewish people how they are to conduct themselves during times of difficulty and persecution. Both Judith and Esther are prefigurements of Mary, the Blessed Mother, who through her faithfulness to God has conquered the devil. The interesting detail of these books is that God uses the least likely people to win his victories. And so we begin our reflection on the books of Judith and Esther. The book of Judith, which follows directly after the book of Tobit, which we discussed last week, the story is situated during the Assyrian domination of the Jewish people and of Judah. The name Judith is simply a feminine version of the word Judah. And so really this woman Judith is representing the entire nation of the Jewish people. And so the story of the book of Judith begins. I'll be reading this summary from the summary of Father Kenneth Baker of this wonderful book of Judith. Nebuchadnezzar, whom we know from the Bible, king of Assyria, decided to invade Israel because it refused to help him in his war with the Medes. He sends his general Holofernes with an army of 120,000 soldiers to the west. They camp near Bethulia in Israel, and there's no real record of any city that bears that name. And so we know, again, this is a story that's meant to relay a certain truth about the Jewish people. The Israelites refuse to surrender. Ancur, the Ammonite, explains to this general that he cannot defeat the Israelites unless they sin against God. As long as they are faithful to God, they cannot be defeated because God is fighting for them. Holofernes takes this suggestion, this prophetic words of his soldier as treason, and so he sends Ancur to Bethulia to perish, as he thinks, with all the inhabitants when he captures it. Holofernes besieges Bethulia and captures the water supply. We get to the point where the Israelites in the city of Bethulia are becoming desperate, and at this point they are speaking about giving up and allowing defeat. Judith, a young woman of Bethulia, argues with the elders against surrender and urges them to trust in God and promises that she will deliver the city. Judith prays before entering the camp of Holofernes. She flatters him and wins his affection and with her beauty and her grace. Holofernes invites Judith to a sumptuous banquet with him alone in his tent. He drinks too much wine, and then, when he is drunk, she cuts off his head with his own sword, which seems to be an allusion to David and Goliath. Judith and her maid take the head in a sack to Bethulia and show it to the elders. Seeing this, Ancur is converted to Israel and their true God. Then the Israelites attack the leaderless Assyrians and defeat them utterly. The story ends with the canticle of Judith. She lives in honor and dies still a widow at the ripe old age of 105. That's the story, the summary of the book of Judith. And in this book, we see some very important themes that were so important for the people, the Israelites, to hear, especially since when they were during that time of captivity, as we know, when the north was overwhelmed by the Assyrian armies, and many of them were encamped and many of them were taken into exile. And during that time, both the story of Tobit, the story of Judith, and the story of Esther, as we will hear, are reminders to the Jewish people how they are to live during difficulties, during persecution, that it's not the end. Judith, in a way, is a symbol to the Jewish people that if they remain faithful to God, even under persecution, that God will deliver them. Not only will He deliver them, He will use the weakest instruments that they have to offer. Think of Judith. She was just a widow, a woman, and she was not the one to be chosen to go and defeat this army of 120,000 Assyrians who are besieging the city. And yet, God chooses her, gives her the conviction, the strength. She prays, and she is able to overwhelm the Assyrians with her plan, and in doing so, she is able to show the mighty power of God. In a similar way, the story of Esther continues in that same theme. Esther is a young woman who, along with her uncle Mordecai, are located in Babylon. Remember, the Babylonian exile happened when Israel was overwhelmed by the Babylonians and people were taken into exile. And then when the Babylonian Empire was defeated by the Persians, we remember that from the book of Ezekiel, many were allowed to return, and Ezekiel was one of them. And it's during that time when the Babylonians are overwhelmed, Persians now are in charge, and Esther is one of the young maidens, Jewish ladies who lives there. And she becomes, by a series of interesting events, she actually is chosen to be the wife of the king of Persia. So she becomes the queen of Persia. And while she is the queen of Persia, there is the evil assistant to the king, Haman. His name is Haman. And Haman hates the Jewish people. He devises a plan to kill them all. And then Mordecai, who is Esther's uncle, pleads with Esther to go to the king and to save them. Now she is afraid because there was strict rules that she as a queen could not approach the king unless she is invited by him first. If she did, she could be killed. And so she was taking in listening to the advice of her uncle Mordecai, she was taking her life in her hands. And so she decides to pray and to fast and asks all the people to do the same. And then she goes and initiates this encounter with the king. And not knowing what's going to happen, the king could easily kill her for appearing before him without being invited. And yet she does it. And when she does it, the king is favorable towards her. She reveals to him the plan of his advisor Haman, and then Haman is executed instead of the Jewish people. Again, both books, the book of Judith and the book of Esther, two very short books, kind of historical novels, you could say parables of the Old Testament. They are two stories of heroic Jewish women who became an example to all the Jewish people and all people of faith, that in times of persecution and difficulty, we are never to give up our trust in God, and that we must continue to live our faith and continue to trust that God will fight our battles, that God will show us the way. You see, they didn't know right off the bat what to do, how to do this, and yet they choose to pray, and because of their prayer and devotion to God and trust that God would save them, they were able to save the Jewish people. And so here we could say that both Judith and Esther are a kind of prefigurement of the Blessed Virgin Mary. You see, this is what's so beautiful about our faith, is that God usually chooses the weak, the insignificant. Not only that, both Judith and Esther are not fighting with the weapons of this world. They're fighting with the weapons of faith, prayer, perseverance, trust in God. And this is perhaps what these books have to offer to us, as they were a great source of affirmation and hope for the Jewish people in persecution, in captivity. They knew that if they simply remain faithful, God can use even the smallest one of them. The weakest person can be used by God to bring about healing and salvation. And the same, we could say, is what happens in the New Testament with the Blessed Virgin Mary, who is the ultimate one who says yes to God. It was because of her faithfulness, her humility, that she was able to battle against the evil one and bring into this world the Savior of all humankind. And so these two simple books are a beautiful gift to us. I want to quote from these two books, first from the book of Judith. The most famous passage is really the last chapter, chapter 16 of the book of Judith, is the so-called hymn of Judith, or hymn to Judith. And this is the hymn that is often used in our Catholic liturgies with regards to the Blessed Virgin Mary as well. But here is what it says. I'll just read a little bit here for you. Starting with chapter 16, verse 5. But the Lord Almighty thwarted them. By a woman's hand he confounded them. Not by youths was the mighty one struck down, or did tyrants bring him low, or huge giants attack him, but Judith, the daughter of Merari, by the beauty of her countenance, disabled him. She took off her widow's garb to raise up the afflicted in Israel. She anointed her face and fragrant oil. With a fillet she fastened her tresses, and put on the linen robe to beguile him. Her sandals caught his eye, and her beauty captivated his mind. The sword cut through his neck. The Persians were dismayed at her daring. The Medes appalled at her boldness. When my lowly one shouted, they were terrified. When my weakling cried out, they trembled. At the sound of the war cry, they took to flight. The sons of slave girls pierced them through. The supposed sons of rebel mothers cut them down. They perished before the ranks of my Lord. A new hymn I will sing to my God. O Lord, great are you and glorious, wonderful in power and unsurpassable. Let yet your every creature serve you. For you spoke and they were made. You sent forth your spirit, they were created. No one can resist your word. The mountains to their bases and the seas are shaken. The rocks like wax melt before your glance. So here is just an example of that beautiful hymn, which again reminds us of how important it was for Judith to trust in the Lord and not to not to try to be someone else, but to be a Jewish woman filled with faith, filled with beauty. And then in the book of Esther, the beautiful and well-known passage is the Prayer of Esther. So here she is. She's about to go and plead with the king for her people, knowing that she could die if she does this and the king is not pleased with her. And so here is her prayer before going, as far as she knows, to her death. Queen Esther, seized with mortal anguish, likewise had recourse to the Lord. Taking off her splendid garments, she put on garments of distress and mourning. In place of her precious ointments, she covered her head with dirt and ashes. She afflicted her body severely, all her festive adornments were put aside, and her hair was wholly disheveled. Then she prayed to the Lord, the God of Israel, saying, My Lord, our King, you alone are God. Help me, who are alone and have no help but you. For I am taking my life in my hand. As a child I was wont to hear from the people of the land of my forefathers that you, O Lord, chose Israel from among all peoples, and our fathers from among their ancestors, as a lasting heritage, and that you fulfilled all your promises to them. But now we have sinned in your sight and you have delivered us into the hands of our enemies because we worshipped their gods. You are just, O Lord. But now they are not satisfied with our bitter servitude, but have undertaken to do away with the decree you have pronounced and to destroy your heritage, to close the mouths of those who praise you, and to extinguish the glory of the temple of your altar, to open the mouth of the heathen, to acclaim their false gods, and to extol the earthly king forever. O Lord, do not relinquish your scepter to those that are not. Let them not gloat over our ruin, but turn their own counsel against them and make an example of our chief enemy. Be mindful of us, O Lord. Manifest yourself in the time of distress and give me courage. So here she is. She's not complaining to God. She's not being difficult. She's acknowledging the sin of her people. She is repeating the stories that she heard about her ancestors. She is humbling herself before God, and yet she is pleading for God's mercy. What a beautiful approach in time of distress. So often we are tempted to complain and to be upset with God in time of distress and difficulty. But ultimately, both Judith and Esther teach us how to remain humble and to acknowledge our sin when we come before the Lord, even as we seek His mercy. The books of Judith and Esther are a beautiful reminder to us that even in times of difficulty and distress, God is with us. And God can even use our little things, our little gifts, our simple prayer, our acts of penance, our acknowledgement of our sinfulness through the sacrament of confession. But never giving up our hope, always trusting that God can do the impossible if we only believe in Him and live our faith to the fullest. Thank you for joining me for this episode of our Bible study on the books of Judith and Esther. God bless you. This is Father Kuzma. Thank you for tuning in to the Catholic Spirituality Podcast. If you wish to send in any questions or comments, I answer those every Friday, and you can send them to catholicspiritualitypodcast@gmail.com. God bless you.